My name is Elizabeth Miller. Pull up a chair, grab your coffee, and let's talk about the exact moment you realize you've been building a life on quicksand. If you've ever had to earn your place in your own family, if you've ever felt like your worth was entirely tied to what you could provide rather than who you actually are, then you are going to understand every single step of the road I traveled. It was a Sunday evening in late March. The air outside was still holding on to that crisp, biting winter chill, but inside my mother-in-law Margaret's dining room, everything felt suffocatingly warm. The room smelled of rosemary roasted chicken and those heavy, expensive lavender candles she insisted on lighting for every single family gathering, even just a routine Sunday dinner. John's parents sat directly across from us. His father, Frank, sat at the head of the table, posture stiff, acting as though he still ran the major manufacturing firm he'd retired from years ago. Margaret sat right beside him, dabbing the corners of her mouth with a cloth napkin after every tiny bite. Then there was Diane, John's younger sister, sitting to my left, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone screen, hidden beneath the table, entirely convinced that nobody noticed her scrolling. I remember looking at the heavy silverware in my hand, thinking about how comfortable everyone looked. And why wouldn't they be? They were living a perfectly curated, upper-middle-class life, and up until that exact night, they believed the illusion was entirely permanent. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my lap. I glanced down and saw my mother's name flash across the screen. My chest tightened automatically. My mother never calls during Sunday dinner, unless something is wrong. I quietly excused myself from the table, stepping out into the dim, quiet hallway to answer it. "Lizzie, honey, it's your father," my mom said, her voice sounding incredibly thin, fragile, and careful. It was the specific tone she always used when she was terrified of becoming a burden to anyone. "The doctor says the latest round of treatments worked. The cancer is stable. But the medical bills, honey, we're short on the deductible this month. I hate to even ask you. I really do." "Mom, stop. Do not apologize," I interrupted gently, leaning against the hallway wall as a hollow ache settled deep into my chest. "I'll handle it. I promise you, I'll take care of it tomorrow morning." I hung up, took a deep breath to steady my shaking hands, and walked back into the dining room. I sat down, picked up my fork, and tried to say it as casually as I possibly could manage. "Hey, so my dad just finished his medical procedure. The good news is the treatment worked, but they've got some heavy bills left over. I'm going to transfer some funds to help them out with their deductible this month." I didn't ask for permission. In 6 years of marriage, I had never once had to ask John how I spent my own hard-earned corporate paycheck, but as soon as the words left my mouth, the room shifted. John set his fork down slowly, deliberately, letting the metal click loudly against the porcelain plate. It was that specific, heavy silence that tells you a massive storm is loading itself directly behind someone's eyes. He looked me dead in the face, completely unbothered by the fact that his entire family was watching. "Your parents, your problem," John said, his voice entirely flat and devoid of empathy. "Your money is yours. My money is mine. We don't use our household stability to bail out external issues." The dining room went quiet in that very specific way. Rooms go quiet when everyone else at the table already agrees with the cruelty that was just spoken. Margaret didn't look up from her plate, but I saw the absolute approval twitching at the corner of her mouth. Frank nodded once, a silent judge confirming a righteous verdict. Diane just kept scrolling, entirely unbothered, as if this was the most normal sentence in the world. Nobody defended me. Nobody even blinked. I looked at John's face, the face of the man I had loved for 11 years, and something inside my soul went completely still. It was like water settling into perfect ice after you stop stirring it. Because sitting there, looking at my husband, looking so incredibly pleased with his own selfish logic, I realized he had just handed me a golden key. He had just given me permission to take absolutely everything back. If you've ever sat in total silence next to someone who is fast asleep, completely unaware that the world they built is about to dissolve, then you know what that night felt like. We drove home from that dinner in near total silence. John reached over at one point, casually squeezing my hand on the center console as if nothing unusual had happened. He actually had the nerve to say, "Dinner was nice, wasn't it?" I just nodded, watching the streetlights slide smoothly across the windshield like liquid silver. "It was," I answered him, and I meant it. It had been a profoundly informative dinner. It's funny how a person can think they are winning a small, petty argument, while in reality, they are handing you the exact blueprint for their own eviction. By the time we pulled into our driveway, my mind wasn't spinning with anger. It was doing arithmetic. If my money was mine and his money was his, then for the first time in our 6-year marriage, I was finally going to follow the rules exactly as they were written. John just had no idea yet that the rules applied both ways. I didn't sleep a wink. I lay there in the dark until around 2 in the morning, listening to the slow, untroubled rhythm of John's breathing. He slept like a man who believed he was completely safe, a man who had said something ordinary at a dinner table instead of something that had just ended a 6-year structural arrangement. Eventually, I slipped out from beneath the covers, crept downstairs to my home office, and closed the door behind me. I booted up my laptop. I told myself I just wanted to verify a few numbers. But that was just the polite version of what I was actually doing. I was doing an audit. I logged into my personal checking account, the one I'd established years before I ever met John, the one he never asked about because he assumed correctly that it wasn't his business. I pulled up 6 years of bank statements and exported them into a spreadsheet. I'm the kind of person who needs to see data in black and white before I let myself fully process the weight of a betrayal. As the rows filled my screen, the reality settled over me like a layer of cold ash. There they were, tidy, recurring monthly transfers, automated and faithful, like a second mortgage on a luxury home I didn't even live in. Every single month, $2,200 went directly to Margaret and Frank's landlord to cover the rent gap when they downsized to a luxury apartment they couldn't afford. Another $350 a month went to cover Diane's car insurance and her recurring vehicle note because John had told me her divorce left her in a bad spot, and family helps family, Liz. But it didn't stop there. There were the utility overages whenever Frank decided to blast the air conditioning all summer long as if it were free. There was a $4,000 direct transfer to a roofing contractor 2 years ago when their rental had an emergency leak. I paused, staring at the screen, as a very specific memory clawed its way to the surface. It was a short, bitter pill of a flashback. I remembered sitting at an Easter brunch right after that roof was fixed. Margaret had leaned over to her garden club friends, her voice loud and dripping with pride, boasting about how John had really stepped up for the family and paid for the entire repair himself. John had sat there, smiling warmly, basking in her praise, accepting the credit without a single glance in my direction. He had been in Chicago on a business trip that entire week. I was the one who took the call from the contractor. I was the one who authorized the wire transfer from my personal account. And then there was the family trip to Florida. Another memory forced its way into my mind. 2 years ago, John had taken his parents and Diane on a week-long resort vacation. He told me it was an immediate family-only trip to help his mother clear her head after a health scare, suggesting it might be awkward if I came along. I had stayed behind and worked 60 hours that week. Looking at the spreadsheet now, the absolute proof was staring back at me. A $5,500 charge for the flights, villas, and dinners, entirely funded by a card tied to my personal account that John kept in his wallet for emergencies. I did the math 3 separate times because I simply didn't trust my own eyes. It came out to exactly $2,500 and change every single month, without fail, for 6 straight years. Over $180,000 of my blood, sweat, and tears had been poured into the comfort of a family that couldn't even remember my father's name when he was facing a life-threatening illness. Not a single dollar had come from John's paycheck. Every ounce of financial burden belonged to me, and every single ounce of gratitude had gone exclusively to him. Type the word boundaries in the comments right now if you've ever looked at a situation in your life and realized you were funding your own disrespect. I sat back in my office chair, the glow of the screen reflecting off my face, and let the sheer scale of the extraction sink into my bones. I wasn't crying. I wasn't breathing heavily. I was just cold. The support beam of our marriage hadn't just creaked. I had just discovered it was completely rotted through. The thing about an image-obsessed enabler is that they never think the stage crew will walk out during the middle of the play. As the clock crawled past 3:00 a.m., I closed the spreadsheet and just stared at the wall. I began analyzing John not as a grieving wife would, but as a forensic investigator analyzes a crime scene. I needed to understand the deep psychological architecture of the lie he had been constructing. John wasn't a cartoon villain. He didn't lock his money away in a secret vault or cackle over his bank statements. He was a highly intelligent, intensely insecure man who suffered from a desperate need to be viewed as the wealthy, successful patriarch of the Miller family. He wanted the prestige of being the golden son who rescued his parents, the heroic older brother who bailed out his sister, and the successful corporate climber who could single-handedly sustain an upper-middle-class dynasty. But there was a massive gap between the reality of his mid-level salary and the grand illusion he presented to the world. And instead of working harder to bridge that gap, he had quietly, seamlessly used my career to build his bridge. He had weaponized my love, my passivity, and my natural desire to be a supportive partner, turning my bank account into his personal public relations fund. Another memory forced its way into my mind, sharp and parasitic. I remembered a family dinner from last Christmas. Frank had stood up at the end of the night, raised a glass of scotch, and presented John with a vintage, custom-engraved gold watch that had belonged to John's grandfather. Frank had tears in his eyes as he said, "To my son, who kept our heads above water this year when the estate taxes came due. You're the anchor of this family, John." John had stood up, adjusted his cuffs, and accepted the watch with a humble, practiced nod. He had looked his father in the eye and said, "Always, Dad. I'll always make sure you guys are taken care of." I had sat at that exact table, clapping softly, genuinely believing that John had worked extra consulting hours or moved some of his own personal investments around to help his dad. Now, staring at the cold reality on my laptop screen, I realized the absolute truth. The exact amount of those estate taxes had been drawn from a line of credit attached to my premarital portfolio. John hadn't contributed a single dime. He had literally purchased his father's ancestral pride with my labor, using my money to buy a reputation he hadn't earned. If you've ever looked at your partner and realized that the person you're sleeping next to is actually a stranger playing a role, drop a comment right now and let me know how you survived that realization. It hurts, doesn't it? It's a heavy, hollow kind of grief. But sitting there in the dark, the grief quickly burned away, leaving behind something incredibly clean and sharp. John had built a beautiful, elaborate theater production, but he forgot who owned the theater. He forgot that the moment the funding stops, the curtains drop, the lights go out, and the actor is left standing alone on an empty stage. He had stood at that dinner table and drawn a line in permanent ink. "Your money is yours, my money is mine, your parents, your problem." He thought he was setting a boundary to protect himself from having to help my aging father. He thought he was being clever, using a cold capitalist logic to shut down my family's needs while keeping his own family's luxury entirely safe. What he didn't realize was that he hadn't built a wall to keep me out. He had just written the legal eviction notice for his own family. I closed my laptop gently. I didn't feel the urge to scream, throw a glass, or wake him up for a massive, tearful confrontation. When an ant has been quietly eating away at the foundation of your house for 6 years, you don't yell at the ant. You just call the exterminator, lay down the trap, and wait. I went back upstairs, slid into bed, and slept soundly for the first time in weeks. I had decided on my strategy: absolute, strict compliance. I was going to follow John's exact rule down to the absolute letter. I was going to give him exactly what he asked for, and I was going to do it in complete, beautiful silence. The next morning, I didn't waste a single second. At exactly 9 a.m., I sat in the office of my financial advisor, Carol. Carol is a sharp, no-nonsense woman who has managed my portfolio since before I even met John. She has a particular talent for reading a room without needing a dramatic explanation. I sat across from her, my coffee going cold in my hand, as she pulled up my accounts on her monitor. "Carol," I said, keeping my voice entirely even, "I need to restructure some things. I want every single recurring automated transfer to the Miller family canceled immediately. The rent assistance, the car insurance, the utility overages, the club fees, all of it, effective the 1st of next month." Carol didn't blink. She just looked at the screen, typed quietly for a few moments, and then looked back up at me. "Are we separating everything, Liz?" "No," I replied, a small, calm smile touching my lips. "I'm just implementing a new household rule. My husband was very clear that my money is mine and his money is his. I'm simply choosing to live by it." She nodded, understanding the gravity of what I was saying without making me spell it out. She slid a clean piece of paper across the desk for my signature. "Done," she said firmly. "The automated sweeps will stop as of the 1st. I've also opened a brand new, completely isolated account for your parents' medical expenses, separate from anything John can see." I signed my name with a steady hand. As the pen scraped against the paper, I felt a physical sensation of something unclenching deep within my chest. An email confirmation landed in my inbox a few hours later with the subject line, "Recurring payments canceled confirmation." I read it twice, closed my laptop, and went about the rest of my day as if nothing had changed. What followed was a grueling, slow-burn psychological stretch of time. There were exactly 19 days between the cancellation and the 1st of the month when the funds would fail to appear. 19 days of living a completely normal domestic life with a man who had no idea his financial safety net was evaporating. If you've ever had to actively act normal while holding a massive secret, you know how heavy that silence can feel. Type the word patience in the comments if you know how much strength it takes to stay quiet when every instinct tells you to scream. Every single night, I sat across from John at our kitchen table. I cooked dinner, I washed the dishes, and I listened to him talk about his corporate meetings, his career goals, and his frustrations with his boss. I nodded in all the right places. I smiled when he made a joke. I asked him how his day was. He reached over, kissed my cheek, and climbed into bed every night, completely untroubled, sleeping like a baby. He had absolutely no clue that the clock was ticking. He truly believed that our conversation at his parents' dinner table had ended the matter. He thought he had successfully put me in my place, protected his own wallet from my family's needs, and maintained his status quo. I would lie awake for a few minutes each night, staring at the ceiling, feeling strangely light for a woman who had just quietly detonated her own marriage. My internal monologue wasn't filled with malice or vindictiveness. It was entirely structural. I felt like a structural engineer who had discovered a massive flaw in a building, walked away from the blueprint, and was simply waiting for gravity to do its job. John had built his entire reputation, his family's lifestyle, and his own inflated sense of masculine authority on my paycheck. He had drawn the boundary in permanent ink, completely confident that the rules would only ever apply to me. He was about to learn a brutal mathematical lesson. When you draw a line in the sand, you have to be prepared to stand on your own side of it when the tide comes in. And the first payment was due to disappear in exactly 48 hours. The phone rang at exactly 8:14 a.m. on the first Tuesday of the month. I was standing at the kitchen counter, slowly pouring myself a fresh cup of coffee, watching the steam rise against the morning light. I didn't even need to look at the screen to know exactly whose name was flashing there. Margaret. I let it ring twice while I carefully set the coffee pot down. Not out of malice or petty cruelty, but simply out of a newly recovered habit. I no longer allowed my hands to shake or my pace to be rushed by people who treated me like a transactional utility. When I finally picked it up and pressed it to my ear, her voice came through immediately. The usual sugary, performative warmth she used for darling Elizabeth was entirely missing. It was sharp, clipped, and breathless. "Elizabeth, there appears to be a massive error with the banking system this morning," Margaret said, barely offering a greeting. "The rent transfer for our landlord didn't come through. Frank called the rental office, and they said the account swept back with a zero authorization notice. You need to call your bank right away and fix the glitch." "There isn't a glitch, Margaret," I said, keeping my voice entirely even, almost pleasant, as I took a slow sip of my coffee. I manually stopped the automated transfers. There was a profound, heavy pause on the line. It was the distinct kind of silence where you can practically hear another human being violently recalculating their entire understanding of a person they thought they completely controlled. You stopped it?" Margaret stammered, her voice dropping into a register of pure disbelief. "Elizabeth, what on earth are you talking about? We depend on that money. Frank's fixed retirement pension doesn't even cover the baseline cost of the property maintenance fee, let alone the rent difference. You know that very well." "I do know that," I replied, staring out the kitchen window at a neighbor walking her dog in the crisp morning air. "But John was incredibly clear at dinner a few weeks ago. He laid down a new household rule for us. My money is mine, and his money is his. He explicitly told me that external family issues are separate responsibilities. I'm just respecting my husband's wishes and following his design." The silence that followed was longer this time, heavier, thicker, with an unexpressed panic. Margaret didn't have a scripted response ready because in 6 long years, she had never once needed to defend her right to my bank account. She had simply assumed the golden faucet would run forever. Before she could recover enough to begin an argument, I wished her a peaceful morning and quietly ended the call. When John came home from work that evening, the atmospheric pressure in our house changed the second he crossed the threshold. He was visibly agitated. His tie was already loosened, his jaw was clamped tight, and he dropped his keys onto the kitchen counter with a hard, unnecessary metallic clatter. It was the exact posture of a man who had spent the last 8 hours absorbing a furious scolding from his mother, and was now looking for the target he felt entitled to dump it on. "My mother called me at the office today," John said, turning to face me, his arms crossed over his chest defensively. "She says you canceled their housing assistance. Elizabeth, what the hell is wrong with you? Are you seriously punishing my entire family over one offhand comment I made at a dinner table weeks ago?" "I'm not punishing anyone, John," I said, leaning back against the island, entirely unbothered by his posturing. "I'm doing exactly what you asked. You stood in front of your family and declared that your money is yours and my money is mine. I simply agreed with you. I am keeping my hard-earned corporate paycheck to myself from now on. Isn't that the exact layout you wanted?" "That's completely different," John said quickly, the defensive words flying out of his mouth before his brain could even process the logical trap he was stepping into. "Different how?" I asked, tilting my head, offering him the floor to explain himself. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, just as fast. I watched his eyes dart around the room, desperately searching the air for an answer, the exact way you watch a person frantically pat down their pockets for a set of keys they suddenly realize they left behind. "It's different because they're my parents, Liz," he finally blurted out, his voice rising an octave. "It's not some cold business transaction." "It wasn't a transaction when I spent the last 2 straight years quietly covering your sister Diane's vehicle, notes and car insurance after her divorce either, John," I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, lethal calm. "But I don't remember you calling her situation different back then. In fact, I remember you telling me it was our collective duty." He had absolutely no answer for that. For the first time in 11 years of knowing this man, I watched my husband stand in the center of our own kitchen with absolutely nothing to say. His phone buzzed on the counter, a loud, violent vibration that shattered the tense quiet between us. Then it buzzed again. Diane's name lit up the lock screen in bright white letters. John didn't look at me as he snatched the phone up and stepped quickly into the living room to take the call. Even with the door partially closed, I could hear his voice drop into that low, frantic, placating tone he always used whenever he was trying to manage his sister's erratic emotions instead of actually addressing her problems. I couldn't make out every syllable, but I didn't need to. Phrases like insurance lapse notice, legal driving status, and just let me figure this out. Diane drifted through the drywall. Diane's automated car insurance payment had bounced, and for the first time since her divorce, nobody was quietly stepping in to absorb the damage for her. Later that evening, while we were getting ready for bed, the phone rang again. This time it was Frank. I watched John's posture shift instantly as he answered it. His shoulders straightened. His voice grew firmer, more defensive. It was the tone of a son desperately trying to sound like a commanding adult, while simultaneously absorbing a severe scolding from his own father. "Dad, listen to me. I'm talking to her right now," John muttered, pacing back and forth near the closet. "Just give me a few days to sort through the accounts." A pause. "No, Frank, I'm not going to let it slide. I said I'll handle it." He hung up, threw his phone onto the nightstand, and glared at me as if he expected a tearful apology. I offered him absolutely nothing. I simply pulled back the thick covers and got into bed, picking up a novel from my nightstand just like any other ordinary evening. "Frank wants to talk to you directly tomorrow," John said, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "He says he wants to sit down and handle this like adults." "He's more than welcome to call me himself, John," I replied, without turning my head from the page. "But let me save you both some time. Nothing is going to change. I'm not reinstating a single transfer." John sat heavily on the very edge of the mattress for a long, agonizing moment. His shoulders were hunched forward, his head down, staring at his blank phone screen as if it might magically rearrange itself into a completely different conversation if he looked at it long enough. I watched him from where I lay, studying this man I had shared a decade with, watching him confront the rigid shape of a boundary for the very first time in his life, instead of the soft comfort of an assumption. I felt no urge to comfort him. I felt no maternal instinct to fix his bruised ego. I had already explained my terms perfectly, using his very own words, at his own family's dinner table. He finally set the phone face down and clicked off the bedside lamp, but I could tell from the rigid, shallow rhythm of his breathing that he wasn't sleeping either. Somewhere in that heavy darkness, he was running the numbers in his head for the first time in 6 years. Numbers he had never once had to care about, because I had always quietly neutralized them before they could ever disturb his peace. By the time Saturday afternoon rolled around, John had orchestrated what he called an emergency family meeting at our house. It was entirely his choice, not mine. I didn't protest, because I knew that a theater production only truly ends when the entire audience is forced to see the backstage mechanics. They arrived right at 2 p.m., filing into my pristine living room like a solemn political delegation arriving to negotiate a high-stakes surrender. The only issue was that they genuinely believed I was the one who owed the apology. Margaret sat incredibly stiff on the very edge of our velvet couch, clutching her designer purse in her lap like a shield of physical armor. Frank stood entirely upright near the brick fireplace, his arms tightly crossed over his chest, his jaw set in the rigid manner of a man rehearsing a grand speech he thinks will land with more authority if he refuses to sit down for it. Diane perched anxiously on the arm of the accent chair, her eyes red-rimmed and watery, her phone clutched in her hand like a literal life raft. Margaret spoke first, her voice trembling with an equal mixture of deep hurt and calculated accusation. You knew we completely depended on that monthly assistance to keep our housing stable, Elizabeth. You knew our exact situation, and you just turned the money off without a word, as if we don't even matter to you. No, Margaret, I said, my voice sounding incredibly calm, spacious, and even in the quiet room. I was told by the man of this house that my money was mine. I'm simply the very first person in this family to actually believe him. Frank stepped in immediately, his voice significantly louder, ringing through the high ceilings of our living room with a theatrical flair. This isn't about some offhand comment at a dinner table, Elizabeth. This is about baseline family loyalty. We have treated you like one of our very own blood relatives since the day you married into this family. I almost laughed out loud at that, but I kept my composure perfectly. Laughing would have given the moment far more heat and drama than it actually deserved. Instead, I just looked at him steadily, letting the silence stretch out until he shifted his weight uncomfortably. Family loyalty, I repeated softly, letting the words hang in the air like a question mark. That is an interesting choice of words, Frank, especially considering my father was in the hospital facing an incredibly serious medical crisis last month, and not a single person in this room called to ask how he was doing. Nobody sent a card. Nobody even bothered to remember his name. The room went entirely vacant of sound. Diane instantly dropped her gaze to her lap, her fingers twitching against her phone. Margaret's mouth opened slightly, as if to offer a defense, then snapped shut when she realized there wasn't a single lie in what I had just said. John, who had been standing anxiously near the doorway the entire time, tried to slide into his familiar role of the diplomatic peacemaker. He held his hands up, trying to act like a neutral mediator, balancing two warring factions, except one of those factions was his own wife, and the other was a group of people who had been living comfortably off her corporate labor for years. Liz, come on, let's be reasonable here, John said, taking a step toward the center of the room, his voice dripping with forced warmth. Can't we figure something out? Maybe we don't have to reinstate everything all at once, but we can find a middle ground, a compromise that keeps everyone stable. No, John, I said simply, cutting him off cleanly before his sentence could morph into a manipulative request, dressed up as a marital compromise. I stood up, walked calmly to the dark woodside table, and pulled open the top drawer. I took out a thick, heavy manila folder that I had prepared days earlier with Carol's help. It was dense, packed with 6 years of printed, official bank statements, meticulously highlighted in bright yellow and organized by category. I walked back over to the coffee table and dropped it onto the glass surface with a heavy, definitive thud. I opened it slowly, letting the room absorb the sheer physical weight of the documentation they were looking at. If we are going to discuss family loyalty and stability, I said, my voice completely unhurried, then we are going to use real data. Let's look at the numbers together. I turned the folder around so they could see the columned layouts. Rent assistance for the luxury apartment, car insurance and monthly vehicle notes for Diane, utility overages, the emergency roof repair invoice, the landscaping truck loan that Frank took out, the $5,000 luxury resort trip to Florida that I fully funded but wasn't invited to because it was immediate family only. I read each line item aloud, calmly, without a single ounce of emotional embellishment, letting the raw math speak for itself. Every single month, for 6 straight years, exactly $2,500 and change has left this specific account, I said, looking up from the pages. The total lifetime drain comes out to just over $180,000. The room went completely, utterly paralyzed. Margaret's hand drifted slowly to her chest, her breath catching audibly in her throat. Frank's tightly crossed arms slowly uncrossed, his shoulders sinking, and for the very first time since he had walked into my home, he looked less like a judge delivering a righteous verdict and more like a criminal, realizing he was standing trial. Diane finally broke the silence, her voice sounding incredibly small, hollow, and genuinely shocked. I didn't know it was that much money, Elizabeth. I swear, none of us knew it was that much. None of you knew, I replied, looking directly at her, because none of you ever bothered to ask. You just assumed the safety net would exist forever without ever questioning who was actually weaving the rope. John stared at the open folder on the table as if it belonged to a complete stranger. His face had gone completely pale, his skin almost translucent under the living room lights, his jaw working silently as he tried to swallow down the rising panic. I watched something massive shift directly behind his eyes. It wasn't guilt. Not yet. It was the early, terrifying stages of an image-obsessed enabler, realizing that the grand story he had told himself and his family about his own masculine generosity was about to completely collapse right in front of them. I closed the heavy folder gently, the slap of the cardboard against the glass coffee table sounding like a gavel coming down. I looked around the room at each of them in turn, intentionally holding their gaze. I saw Margaret's stricken, pale face, Frank's collapsed, uncertain posture, Diane's quiet, burning shame. And finally, I looked at John, who was still frozen near the doorway, like an actor who had forgotten his next line and wasn't sure which side of the stage he belonged on. There's just one more detail you all need to look at, I said, my voice completely steady, quiet, and unhurried. You should probably ask John exactly where he told you all this money was coming from for the last 6 years. Every single head in that living room turned toward my husband at the exact same moment. It was a synchronized, snapping motion. And for the very first time in our 11 years together, I watched the immaculate, charming facade that John had built for his family start to completely tear apart at the seams. Margaret turned toward her son slowly, the way people move when they already suspect the answer is going to destroy them, and they are trying to brace their bodies for the impact. "John," she said, her voice dropping into a careful, fragile whisper, "what does she mean by that? What is she talking about?" John didn't answer right away. He stood there, his hand gripping the white wooden door frame so tightly that his knuckles turned entirely bloodless. I watched his practiced corporate charm fail him completely. He looked incredibly small in his own house. "John," Frank barked, his voice dropping into a lower, harder, deeply disappointed register. "Look at me and answer your mother. Where did you tell us this money was coming from?" I could have easily answered for him. I had the official bank statements, the tracking dates, and the clear wire transfers laid out in neat columns right there on the table. But I stayed completely quiet. Some truths land with a far more devastating psychological weight when the person who spent years hiding them is forced to pull them into the light with their own voice. "I told them it was from us, Liz," John finally muttered, his eyes glued to the hardwood floor. "From our joint household funds. I told them we were doing incredibly well in our careers, and that I wanted to make sure they were taken care of." "Use?" I repeated softly, letting the word echo in the quiet room. "There is no joint household fund for this, John. There never was. Every single transfer came directly out of my personal premarital checking account, the one funded solely by my corporate salary. You never contributed a single dollar to any of it. You didn't just hide the arrangement from me. You hid the source from them." Margaret's face cycled through several distinct expressions in a matter of seconds. Confusion, pure disbelief, and finally a deep, heavy mask of grief. It was the specific grief of a mother realizing that the beautiful story she had told herself about her successful, protective son was a complete fiction. "You told me you were taking care of us," she said to John, her voice cracking under the weight of the realization. "You looked me in the eye every single Christmas and told me you were so proud that you could finally give back to us after everything we sacrificed to raise you." "I wanted you to be proud of me, Mom," John snapped, a desperate, pathetic note of a child breaking through his adult exterior. For a single fleeting second, I almost felt a wave of pity for him. Almost. But then the memory of him sitting at that Sunday dinner table, casually eating his chicken while dismissing my father's life-threatening illness as a problem that wasn't his concern, locked itself back into place. John had purchased his family's pride with my financial labor. He had literally bought his status as the golden son using my paycheck, without my knowledge, while simultaneously treating my own parents like a heavy burden. The dynamics in the room shifted entirely. What had walked through my front door as righteous collective anger directed at me had completely curdled into something incredibly uncomfortable for them. The family was forced to look at the person they trusted most and realize he had been quietly exploiting his wife to build a monument to his own ego. John reached out, grabbed my forearm, and gestured urgently toward the kitchen. "Can we please talk about this privately, Liz? Just for 5 minutes." I followed him into the kitchen, mostly because I didn't want an audience for the final boundary I was about to draw. He closed the door halfway behind us, his face twisting with a volatile mix of raw panic and absolute humiliation. "You are completely destroying my reputation in front of my entire family," he hissed, his voice a low, frantic whisper. "You destroyed your own reputation, John," I replied, standing perfectly still. "I'm just the person who turned the lights on so everyone could see the damage. You built an entire life on my paycheck. And the second I asked to use my own money to help my dying father, you told me he wasn't your problem. We are done living in your theater production." We walked back into the living room together, and I could feel every eye instantly shift toward us, waiting to see whose side the next sentence would land on. I sat back down, folded my hands in my lap, and looked around at all of them with complete composure. "If we're going to talk about money in this family from now on," I said, "we're doing it properly. All the numbers out in the open, with someone completely neutral in the room to keep it honest." Margaret opened her mouth to object, then looked at the heavy folder, looked at her son, and slowly closed it again. 2 days later, I sent out the invitations in writing, leaving absolutely no room for anyone to later claim they misunderstood the terms. I also hired Carol, my financial advisor, to join us not as a favor, but as a professional mediator. If this family wanted to treat our lives like a financial transaction, we were going to talk about it with someone who dealt exclusively in facts, not feelings. We met the following Sunday afternoon in a small, neutral conference room arranged through Carol's office. There was no kitchen for anyone to storm off into, no living room couches to grip like life preservers. Just a long glass table, water glasses, and enough daylight pouring through the windows that nobody could hide in the shadows. My parents arrived first. My father, Robert, walked in a bit slower than he used to, leaning slightly on my mother's arm, but he wore his good sweater and shook Carol's hand like a man attending an important meeting. My mother, Linda, sat close beside him, her hands folded neatly, asking for nothing and expecting nothing, the way she always has. The contrast between them and the Millers was immediate. Margaret and Frank arrived next, dressed far more formally than the occasion required, as if formality might restore the unearned authority they sensed slipping away. Diane came alone, quieter than I've ever seen her, her phone left completely inside her bag for once. John sat beside me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he didn't try to fill the silence with manufactured charm. Carol opened her laptop and walked the room through 6 years of documentation, calmly, professionally, and entirely without editorial judgment. She read the numbers the way an accountant reads numbers, which somehow made the reality land harder than if I had delivered it myself with tears in my eyes. When she finished, the room sat in a silence heavier than any argument. Even Margaret, who had spent the last month insisting I was overreacting, looked down at the printed summary like it belonged to a different family entirely, one far more dependent than she had ever allowed herself to admit. "I'm not here to punish anyone," I said into the quiet room, keeping my voice even. "I'm here because for 6 years, decisions were made about my money without my knowledge. Credit was taken that wasn't earned. That ends today. Not our relationship, but the arrangement. Going forward, there will be no unconditional support, no transfers without my direct knowledge, and no one deciding on my behalf what my family is worth compared to his." Frank was the first to look down at the table and say the words nobody else could manage. "We got comfortable," he said quietly. Comfortable enough not to ask where it came from, as long as it kept coming. Diane looked up, her voice small but honest. "I have to get a second job. I should have had one already. I just never thought I'd need one." Nobody clapped. Nobody hugged. This wasn't that kind of cinematic ending. But when the meeting closed and everyone filed out into the parking lot, Margaret paused beside me for just a brief moment. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for being more honest with us than my own son was." I simply nodded and let that be enough. In the weeks that followed, a particular kind of peace settled into my life. I took a portion of the funds that used to disappear into the Miller family's expenses and redirected it exactly where I had always wanted it to go. I paid off the remainder of my father's medical bills in full. I hired a contractor to finally fix the sagging porch steps. My parents had been carefully stepping around for 2 years. I even set aside enough to send them both on a small, relaxing trip to a lake house upstate. I realized that I had spent 6 long years funding other people's unearned comfort while ignoring my own parents' joy. My father cried when I told him about the porch. He's not a man who cries loudly. It was just a quiet welling in his eyes as he sat in his recliner, waving his hand as if he were embarrassed by his own gratitude. "You don't have to do all this, Lizzie," he whispered. "We managed before." "I know you did, Dad," I said, sitting beside him and taking his hand. "But you shouldn't have to just manage anymore. This isn't charity. This is love." John tried in his own way to make things right. He apologized more than once, and I could tell some of it was genuine, buried deep under the panic of nearly losing a life he had taken for granted. But I noticed something telling in his apologies. He kept circling back to the consequences. His mother's disappointment, his sister's financial scramble, the awkwardness at gatherings. He rarely circled back to the actual wound, the fact that he had dismissed my parents as a problem that wasn't his concern. I didn't file for divorce, not yet, but separate accounts stayed strictly separate. Major financial decisions required both of us out loud at the table, and we entered marriage counseling. I needed to know if the man sitting across from me was truly capable of changing, or simply capable of being sorry when caught. Whether that agreement holds is something only time will answer. Meanwhile, the Miller family adjusted the way people do when a safety net is finally removed, and they discover they are more capable than they thought. Margaret and Frank downsized into a smaller apartment that actually fit their pension. Diane took a second job at a dental office 3 towns over, and the first time she called me, it wasn't to ask for money. It was to tell me, almost sheepishly, that she had made her very first car payment entirely on her own. It felt strange, she admitted, but good. A few nights ago, I sat at my parents' kitchen table for dinner. My mother made pot roast, and my father told the exact same story about his old fishing trip that he's told 100 times before. I laughed at it as if it were the first time, because some things deserve that kindness. Halfway through dinner, my phone lit up on the table with John's name. "Can we talk?" I looked at it for a moment, feeling the faint pull of 11 years of habit. Then I turned the phone face down and went back to my mother's pot roast, back to my father's story, and back to the people who had never once made me feel like a burden or a transaction. He told me my money was mine, so I finally believed him. If you've made it this far with me, I want to know. What do you think? Do you think a marriage can truly recover after this kind of structural rot is exposed, or has too much already been broken? Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story, and I'll see you in the next one.